What's up, everyone? So, I know I'm pretty late with this response video since I know Patrick's video is 2 years old as of this video's upload, and I know there have been a lot of response videos made to it already. I just kind of feel like there are a lot of arguments that even those responders kind of missed, so here's my take on it. Because unlike anyone else, I actually thought his video could have been a decent enough video, since I do agree that there are certain things that people incorrectly regard as plot holes, and most plot holes in films can be explained if you just pay enough attention. But the way he addresses these arguments is just so elitist. He basically lumps all complaints as equally insignificant and just brushes off any criticism of films with legitimate problems in them. And it just frustrates the crap out of me, so let's address his arguments. So he starts off with saying that people complain about plot holes all the time, even pointing out several examples of how they've taken over internet culture, and then he says,
back in April, when A Quiet Place opened, my Twitter and Facebook feeds were filled with people complaining about all the plot holes. I saw one guy say he'd made a list of 41 plot holes in that movie. But here's the thing. No one seems to actually know what a plot hole is. And all those plot holes people complain about, they don't actually matter.
And right off the bat, we have a very smug and even condescending argument where he basically says that people are ignorant when it comes to plot holes, and therefore their complaints about them don't mean shit. Instead of actually listening to their arguments about why they consider certain things to be plot holes, he just does the thinking for them and says that they're basically complaining about nothing. Great way to hook your audience in there, bud.
So, what is a plot hole? People's definitions vary, but here's the generally accepted one that I use.
You see what he just said there? People's definitions vary, but here's the one that I use. He literally just said that people don't know what plot holes are, and yet a second later he says that their definitions vary. How could people not know what it is, and yet have their own definition of what it is? And how do we know we can trust your individual definition when you could just be one of those people? Just because other people define something differently, that doesn't mean that they're wrong.
A plot hole is a point in which a story breaks a previously established rule about its own universe. Basically, it's when a story contradicts itself.
Well, that's a definition, but it's not the only definition. He's basically dismissing all other types of plot holes and using his own subjective definition, by his own admission, to define all types of plot holes. There's also the narrative plot hole, the character plot hole, the transition plot hole, etc. What's more, he's saying it this way so he can basically manipulate his arguments to sound more objective, when he's forgetting that plot holes themselves are very subjective and can affect people differently depending on the film in question.
So here's what are not plot holes.
In The Dark Knight Rises, we never see how Batman gets back to Gotham City. That's a plot hole.
Again, notice how that was said. We never see how he gets back to Gotham. This is when he starts using these huge straw man arguments to basically illustrate a point completely irrelevant to the examples that he brings up. The fact is, with the Dark Knight Rises example, people have never said we never see him get back to Gotham, but rather we don't know how he got back to Gotham. See, a movie doesn't have to show us everything, but it does have to leave enough for us to at least put things together ourselves. That's what a good movie does. It treats the audience as thoughtful. But for some reason, he uses this example to talk about montages?
One of the earliest cinematic developments was the concept of montage. The idea is that when two images are presented in sequence, the audience understands that they occur chronologically and will mentally fill in the time between scenes. So for instance, if a person is in one location and the next scene they're in another location, we understand that in between scenes they traveled between the locations.
That would actually be relevant if the Dark Knight Rises example was a normal circumstance. But it isn't. It literally shows Bruce escaping the Lazarus pit, and then when we next see him, he's all of a sudden already in Gotham and was even able to track down Selina Kyle. Montage doesn't really explain it because the practicality of the situation demands a better answer.
Movies tend to assume that the audience is reasonably intelligent, but I guess they're wrong. If movies showed us every single second that happened during the span of the story, they would be 40 hours long and really f***ing boring.
Which is why no one ever asks for every second. We just want the movie to do its job and give us a small hint so that we could mentally fill in the gaps. The movie doesn't give us any clues about how he got back to Gotham. He's stranded in some unspecified distant country with no money or resources, And furthermore, even if he did get back, he wouldn't even be able to get back into Gotham because it's been completely closed off. And by the way, it's very presumptuous and even egotistical to assume that the audience is not reasonably intelligent just because we can't figure out something that the movie did a poor job explaining. But we'll get to that later.
There are so many plot holes in A Quiet Place. Oh, it's such a great movie. I mean, like, why did they decide to have a baby? And why didn't they just move to the waterfall? Oh!
Okay, first of all, allow me to just debunk this real quick. First of all, how could they move to the waterfall? The waterfall was not a habitable place to live, it was just a safe place where they could talk aloud. Secondly, they had a baby because they had just lost their other one, and it was kind of their way of starting over, as it were, which is something that couples often do when they sadly lose a child. Furthermore, the world population is near extinction, so they would have to do what they can to preserve the population as much as possible. Not to mention, it's actually kind of inspiring that they wouldn't let something like an alien invasion prevent them from having kids, even if those aliens fed off of something as sensitive as sound. But the way he addresses these arguments is just kind of enraging.
This is the one that really drives me nuts. Movies are, for the most part, about human beings, or at least characters who think and act like human beings. And you know what human beings are not? Logical. People are impulsive. They make choices based on emotion. Not everyone thinks exactly the same. And also, people make mistakes. You know how in Star Trek, Vulcans live dominated by logic, and it's established that acting logically is at odds with acting human. So if everyone acted totally logically all the time, only making the most logical decision in any situation, no one would be acting human. Thus, there would be no conflict, which would lead to no drama, which would lead to no stories. And movies would be really f***ing boring.
Bullshit!
Honestly, that's kind of a cop-out. He's basically excusing lazy writing and characters perceived to be idiots as humans are just imperfect. Yes, humans make illogical choices, but I'm pretty sure it's been scientifically proven somewhere that they only behave illogically under extreme circumstances.
People make bad choices if they're mad or scared or stressed.
The people in A Quiet Place were not behaving illogically, they were doing everything that in their minds was perfectly rational and were prepared for everything that would happen to them. But if something in a movie is actually illogical, you can't just let it go so easily with "we're only human." If a child does something bad, do you just excuse it with "kids are just naive"? Movies are not documentaries. They're not about humans behaving illogically. That's what we have YouTube cringe videos for. Movies are about characters with established personalities going on a journey and overcoming a major challenge. But if something actually sticks out from that journey that somehow takes someone out of it, then to them, the movie can fail.
There is a huge plot hole in Star Wars. I mean, come on. Why would the Death Star have such an obvious design flaw?
Okay, some of these can be valid complaints. Sometimes there's a story development that's a little too convenient.
I love how he uses the Death Star example for his next point, but then goes on to point out that it's not a good example.
Would it be too much to ask if we could make up our minds?
Like in the 2009 Star Trek, Kirk just happens to get stranded on the same planet as old Spock, and they end up in the same cave together so Spock can explain what's going on. I like the movie, but that's a little contrived and lazy. But it's not a plot hole.
Well, that depends on the individual watching it and how much it affects their enjoyment of it. Some things like that only require minor suspensions of disbelief and are really only there to help the flow of the narrative. Again, plot holes are subjective, but they can matter depending on the movie in question and the individual watching it.
I mean, how does Benicio del Toro know the rebels' plans? Nobody told him. That's a plot hole.
At least 50% of the plot holes that I see people complain about are things that are actually explained in the movie if you just pay attention. Like that one in The Last Jedi, there's a scene where you see DJ listening as Poe tells Finn and Rose the Resistance's plan. But I guess if you're too busy live tweeting about plot holes, you can miss some stuff.
Really? Can you be any more of a condescending ass?
Okay, I will agree that some things in the movie are explained, as I pointed out before. However, what he's failing to mention is that sometimes the movie does a poor job explaining it. It's not always the audience's job to figure everything out. Again, the movie has to give us enough so we can put things together ourselves, and if it doesn't, that would be considered a plot hole.
If you want, you can find plot holes anywhere. They're all over your favorite movies. In Lord of the Rings, the Eagles could have just flown the ring to Mount Doom and saved everyone all that trouble.
Except the Eagles are not a taxi service. They are their own intelligent species who only flew them out at the end because they owed Gandalf a favor. Not to mention the Eye of Sauron literally watching over everything.
In Toy Story, why does Buzz freeze like the other toys when he thinks he's a real person?
Probably a directive under Space Ranger regulations to not distress beings more powerful than him, even if that means to not let them know he's actually alive.
In Ocean's 11, how did they get the flyers into the vault? In Cinderella, why does the glass slipper stay when everything else disappears? In Alien, if the acid can melt through the floor, why doesn't it melt through the entire ship? In Gremlins, what does after midnight technically mean? Isn't it always after midnight? How does that rule make any sense? In Star Wars, why does the Death Star have a trash compactor when they can just jettison the trash into space?
Except, even by your own definition, pretty much everything you mentioned are not even plot holes. They're just inconsequential nitpicks that most people wouldn't complain about anyway because they can all probably be explained in their own way.
Look, if you want to watch stuff this way, you can even find plot holes in this video. Why am I wearing sunglasses if I'm inside? I'm indoors in one shot and outdoors in the next, but we never see me go outside. Plot hole.
Whatever, it's called editing, bro.
Except you haven't actually established the logic of your own video, so why would we consider anything in it to be a plot hole? Maybe you just want to be fancy with your presentation. Everyone does it.
You can find plot holes or logic gaps in any movie, and if you want to, go right ahead. Just don't tell me that those are genuine flaws and problems and reasons that a movie is bad, because they're not.
Wrong!
None of these things actually matter, because they're not what a movie is about.
But they can affect what a movie is about. That's the whole point. The reason why people complain about them is because, depending on how big they are, they can take people out of it. Your way of viewing things is not the same as other people's.
So even though most people are using the term plot hole incorrectly, all of these complaints are rooted in the same thing. But movies aren't about logic. They're not equations, they're not proofs, they're not puzzles.
But there is a skill in making movies. It's an art form. There is a math to it. Just because movies aren't about a certain thing, that doesn't mean that they can't have that certain thing in them. Now granted, there is a good number of movies that just require you to turn your brain off and just enjoy the ride. However, there are also movies that people go to because they want to be challenged or inspired or moved, which to me says that he doesn't really take movies as seriously as other people, which is not fair to the visual medium of storytelling.
On the site movieplotholes.com, there are 7 plot holes listed for Die Hard. The first one says that the villain's plan is to stage a hostage situation so that the police will shut down power to the building, allowing them to access the vault. But since they would have already had detailed plans of the building, they could have just shut down power themselves, making the whole thing more simple.
Once again, that one is explainable. They did have detailed plans of the building, but they did not have detailed plans of the entire power grid the building was on. Remember, their initial plan was to get Mr. Takagi to open it for them, but he wouldn't cooperate, so they had to do it manually. They established that the electromagnetic seal was the one thing they couldn't control, so their whole plan consisted of attracting the attention of the FBI and getting them to do what they already do by shutting off the power and essentially opening the vault for them. Basically, their plan was to humiliate the FBI and give them the finger by getting rich. But again, the way he addresses it is just... ugh.
I know it seems impossible to watch movies wrong, but you're watching movies wrong.
To say that we're not watching movies correctly is kind of an arrogant and even snobbish thing to say. You've even perfectly illustrated it with this camera angle of you looking down your nose at the viewer.
Die Hard is a movie about an ordinary man thrown into an impossible situation, who needs to rise to the occasion and persevere so that he can reunite with his estranged wife. That's the point of the movie. That's what it's about. Most of the other plot holes for Die Hard listed on the site are variations on, why didn't John McClane do this? Well, because the whole point of John McClane is that he's a normal guy who makes human mistakes. If he did the perfect, most logical thing every single time, he wouldn't be the same character. He'd basically be a Vulcan, and the movie would end way earlier and be terrible.
Actually, I would argue that John McClane does everything as logical as possible. When there's a hostile takeover, he looks for the nearest exit. When he's in a safe place, he looks for the nearest phone. He pulls the fire alarm to alert the authorities. When he's confronted by any of the terrorists, he does what he can to stay alive. The point of John McClane is not that he's human and makes mistakes. The point of him is that he's the wrong guy in the wrong place at the wrong time, and yet he still perseveres despite the odds against him. That's what makes him a hero.
Take Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. At the climax of the story, Harry reaches the Triwizard Cup, which turns out to have been turned into a portkey that transports him to Voldemort. So the villain's whole plan hinged on Harry being the one to get to the cup first and win the tournament. But really, Any random object could have been turned into a port key, and they could have sent him to Voldemort way earlier without all that hassle.
Okay, I can't really respond to that point since I've never seen any of the Harry Potter movies or read the books, but I don't like the point that he makes because of it.
But that doesn't matter. We're so invested in Harry trying to figure out a way to win, and then so surprised by the reveal of the port key and Voldemort returning, that to pick apart the logic of the villain's plan would mean totally disengaging from the story.
No, it would mean that whoever is picking apart the logic of it is paying close enough attention to notice something like that and are distracted by it well enough that it takes them out of it. It's kind of narrow-minded to say that we should only focus on one thing and not look at the broader picture of what the movie is showing us.
This, like so many plot holes, are things that would just destroy any conflict or drama and end the story immediately.
Except that's not necessarily the audience's fault, it's the movie's fault for being lazily written. The fact that the audience cares well enough to pick apart its logic is the effect, while the holes in the movie's logic are the cause.
Like, sure, to an objective, omniscient viewer, it would make logical sense for Admiral Holdo to tell Poe Dameron her plan. And then there would be no conflict and no drama. Poe would never send Finn on a mission, and Finn would never grow, and Poe would never grow, and there would be no story.
What? Movies don't need to be contrived for the sake of a narrative. Characters don't need to be illogical for the sake of a narrative. You can create movies with characters making totally rational choices and still have it be engaging. It all depends on the execution of it.
And also, Holdo explains why she doesn't tell him the plan. She doesn't trust him. He just f***ed up and got demoted. She has no reason to.
Still, that's a pretty lame excuse to not tell someone, specifically her own son, the very crucial plans of saving their entire fleet. Especially when you would know that that person is a loose cannon with an attitude problem.
Again, if you think this is a plot hole, or you're annoyed because of the logic here, you're kinda watching movies wrong.
Who the hell died and made you the master of how movies are enjoyed? There is no right or wrong way to enjoy something. People watch them how they watch them. Your way of viewing things is not the golden standard of how to view things.
There's an episode of the show Community that imagined what a horror movie would look like if all the characters only made totally logical decisions.
Should we go check it out?
No. We should call 911 on my fully charged cell phone, lock the doors, and then stand back to back in the middle of the room holding knives.
And the conclusion is that it would be really boring.
Actually, no, because there's still one thing both you and them are forgetting. The actual threat. More appropriately, the villain. There's still so much scenarios where that could still be engaging. What if the villain is just as smart as them? What if the villain shuts off the power and picks them off one by one? What if the villain is supernatural? Again, it all depends on the almighty rule, execution.
I am in no way telling you to turn your brain off or to not think critically about movies. Not at all.
Bullshit! Bullshit!
I'm saying you should worry about the things that actually matter.
Sure, by dictating to us what you believe actually matters.
So, take Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice. I think it's a bad movie, and it has big old dumb logic issues, like why can Superman locate Lois Lane from her heartbeat but can't find his mother the same way?
There is nothing in the movie that implies that he finds people by the sound of their heartbeat. That's stupid. He finds her by the sound of her screaming voice. If you're talking about after she was initially kidnapped, it's because Superman was still on the other side of the world at that point. If you're talking about after he talks to Lex Luthor, there was actually a deleted scene where he did just that. But since deleted scenes don't actually count, you could still say that he went looking for his mother. When he shows up to apprehend Luthor, Luthor sets the clock at 1 hour. They talk for about 3.5 minutes, and then when we next see the clock, it's literally at 34 minutes left. So it's perfectly reasonable to assume that he still went looking for his mother. I guess Lex Luthor just did a good job at hiding her and keeping her quiet.
Why doesn't Wonder Woman, who isn't affected by kryptonite, be the one to use the spear against Doomsday?
Because she already has the task of holding him tight in one place? You do realize that defeating Doomsday was literally a team effort, right? Not to mention, Superman would have wanted to do it himself anyway because it literally completes his whole character arc in the film.
But those aren't the real problems with the movie. The actual problems are that many of the central characters are totally static and poorly motivated, and they don't learn anything or grow through the story.
Yes, they do, actually. You just have to pay close enough attention to notice it, which you've already argued people should be doing more often anyway.
And the one major moment of growth is caused by a ridiculous plot contrivance. So as much as I enjoy making fun of some dumb logic gaps in that movie, they still don't really matter.
So, you're basically cherry-picking the problems with film writing by saying that one thing doesn't matter just because something else matters more?
Why is it that in the 80s or 90s or early 2000s, no one really cared about plot holes? They still existed, but no one ever complained a movie was bad because of all the plot holes.
Actually, yes, they did. People have talked about plot holes pretty much ever since the beginning of movies. Hell, since the dawn of storytelling in general, they've talked about them. Who's to say that no one ever brought up those things in conversation? Sure, people talked about it, they just didn't have a medium where they could discuss it abroad.
So what happened? Basically, the internet. Because I like driving myself insane, I searched back through Google year by year for references to plot holes. Until about 2007, they only appeared in movie reviews and forum posts. They hadn't gone fully mainstream yet. They hadn't been embraced by the public.
And that's not entirely true. The internet did not make people complain about plot holes, it just created a medium where people could finally express their concerns about them.
Pop culture commentary from a nerdy fan perspective began exploding in popularity. And immediately, the types of videos that proved most popular were humorous analyses of popular movies focusing on surface-level nitpicks. And over the next several years, these types of videos grew in number and popularity. For many people, especially millennials and whatever the generation after millennials is called, most film criticism they consume is on YouTube. And not all, but a lot of this is surface-level critique, focusing on nitpicks, and chief among those nitpicks, plot holes. Plot holes don't really mean anything, but they're good clickbait, and those videos get views, and they multiply.
Yes, we get it, CinemaSins is partially responsible and you don't like them. And like I said, the reason that plot holes are good clickbait is because they can be legitimate concern and can help people see things in a movie they never noticed before. People like to view things differently. It helps them to understand it better and have a better appreciation for it, even taking into account all the plot holes it has. This isn't a bad thing, it just allows people to have a more informed opinion on it more than anything. That's the whole point of my channel.
And people watch them and believe them and repeat those points in conversation. And when they watch movies, they think about these surface-level nitpicks. They look for them. No one is really to blame for this. Okay, CinemaSins definitely deserves some of the blame.
You don't say.
But it's not just them. This is way bigger. This is about cultural shifts coinciding with evolving technology. And look, as long as movies are popular and people on the internet are making videos for clicks, it's going to keep happening. So look, watch whatever YouTube videos you want, think whatever you want about movies, just please.
I got a better idea. How about you stop acting like some kind of authority on how movies are enjoyed and try to understand why people enjoy noticing plot holes in movies instead of pinning it all on the internet and saying that people are objectively wrong for watching movies a certain way? How about you actually have conversations with these people instead of just condescendingly criticizing them for taking movies more seriously than you? How about you let people either enjoy or criticize movies however they want and try to inform them on small things that could be argued as not important instead of generalizing what plot holes are and lumping people's complaints as equally insignificant? Why don't you...
Was the punching too aggressive? Maybe a bit?
Oh, you think?